Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. As a literary and cultural historian, I am, I think understandably, fascinated by linguistic and dialectic nuances and also how they shift across history. Additionally, as a very happy transplant to the East End of London, my interest in these things has, I think perhaps naturally, turned towards Cockney rhyming slang. So, if I were to say to you the following, that I'm going to sneak down the apples to avoid the trouble, which will be easy as she's a bit mutton, then get on the dog to me old China, so I don't have to go down the rubber on my jacks, maybe we'll go for a ruby, and then I'll head back for a cup of rosy before I'm too cream crackered. Would you have any idea what I was talking about? If you think you do, perhaps you want to put your translation to what I just said in the chat. That's if you're watching in the premiere, or you can do it in the comments if you're watching on the playback. As this is the game we're playing, I'll make it fair and say that once again. What would someone be telling you if they said they were going to sneak down the apples to avoid the trouble, which will be easy as she's a bit mutton, then get on the dog to me old China, so I don't have to go down the rubber on my jacks. Maybe we'll go for a ruby, then I'll head back for a cup of rosy before I'm too cream crackered. And do make sure you stick around to the end of this video because I will be letting you know and you can see if you've got it right or not. I'm sure that this challenge, coupled with what I said at the start and the title of this video, is going to give you a pretty fair idea of what we're going to be looking at today. And so, without further ado, let's take a butcher's at the history of cockneys and their rhyming slang. In 2012, a BBC News headline warned that cockneys were at risk of becoming an endangered species. In 2015, East London's very own Danny Dyer was on a chat show. While there, he joked about freezing his sperm, and I assume donating it, in an attempt to stop the cockney from dying out. This summer, the artist Michael Landy celebrated cockney rhyming slang with an art installation at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in Stratford, East London, where traditional and contemporary cockney rhyming slang was displayed on large fluorescent signs. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first recorded extant use of the term cockney dates to around 1390. This use refers to, quote, the egg of a domestic fowl, perhaps also a small yolkless egg. The last of these definitions is a relatively abnormal occurrence, and arguably, I'd say, an undesirable one, as people, I think, do tend to hope to find a yolk in their eggs. A decade or so later, the term was being used to refer to, quote, a spoilt or pampered person, especially a child, an indulged or undisciplined person, a delicate, fastidious, or feeble person, especially one who is affectedly so, a person who lacks strength of character. By the middle of the 16th century, it was apparently, quote, chiefly depreciative, and described a person from a town or city, as contrasted with inhabitants of rural areas, and typically characterised as delicate, pampered, feeble, or affected, or as lacking strength of character or practical skills. In the latter half of the 16th century, in 1571 to be exact, we have what is believed to be the first airing of the description of a cockney. It comes from a sermon at Paul's Cross by John Bridges. Quote, we are throughout all the realm called cockneys that are born in London or in the sound of Bow Bell. This has become the enduring understanding of what a cockney is, namely, quote, a native of London, especially a working class person from the East End of London, traditionally a person born within earshot of the sound of Bow Bells, the bells of St Marylebone Church in Cheapside in the City of London. As you will see from this map, which was produced by 24 Acoustics and which takes into account the particular wind direction, the sound of bow bells does seem to have had a rather far reach to the north of the river in 1851. Seeing this does make me feel compelled to point out that according to this map, as my youngest child was born in Homerton Hospital, I now do technically have my very own Cockney in the house. At least I do, by 1851 standards. However, what is also shown here is the fact that modern noise pollution is being blamed for the shrinking of the reach of the bow bells. That's what we see in that blue 2012 area. Within this smaller area, there is apparently no maternity ward, nor are there many residential properties, thus reducing the number of potential home births that might happen in that area too. So, as it stands, barring a few spontaneous births in the shops, restaurants, offices and tube stations that now fill this area, the true-born Cockney is, as that headline warned, now endangered. From the early 19th century, the term Cockney began to be used to refer additionally to, quote, the dialect or accent typical of London Cockneys. Eventually, this dialect would become the Cockney rhyming slang that is still recognisable to those who are familiar with it today. But what is it? Well, Cockney rhyming slang works by replacing a chosen word with perhaps a pair of words or maybe a phrase that rhymes with the original word you are looking to replace, which maybe sounds complicated, so let's look at some examples. Whistle and flute is a common rhyme substitution for suit. Syrup of figs for wig, pork pies for lies, and in some cases it's going to be that whole rhymed phrase that's used as the replacement, but in most cases the rhymed phrase will be shortened. So you wouldn't compliment someone's new whistle and flute, you'd just say, nice whistle. You might notice their syrup, not their syrup of figs, and maybe you'd call them out on their porkies rather than their pork pies. Cockney rhyming slang may have originated as a cryptolect, a secret language designed to be deployed by a particular subculture to foster a sense of shared identity and community, and or as a means to avoid outsiders from understanding what was being said. Its origins are, however, hotly contested. Perhaps it was made by and for criminals, so they could speak freely and evade the understanding of the authorities. However, an alternative suggestion is that East End market stall holders developed it as a means to communicate with each other about things they wanted to keep secret from their potential customers. Or it may have developed out of games of wordplay, used by the various communities of working people of the East End simply to pass the time. Either way, Cockney rhyming slang is not the only codified speech that you would have, or in some cases may still, hear on the streets of London. From around the 16th century, there was cant, sometimes known as thieves' or rogues' cant, and some of you might be aware that I happen to be in possession of a cant dictionary, which I do rather enjoy. This cryptolect was allegedly used principally by untrustworthy persons, thieves, professional beggars, and travellers. How scandalous. It was thought they used it so they could go about plotting their nefarious dealings undetected by their potential victims and or the authorities. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Polari was developed. This is a mix of cant, rhyming slang, Yiddish, Romany, and Italianate words. At the start, it was connected to people of a more nomadic lifestyle, sailors, circus people, entertainers, and the travelling community. In the 20th century, though, Polari was adopted by some gay men. It would feature in the dialogue of the popular radio series Round the Horn, and before the famous Madame Jojo's closed in 2014, the staff there used Polari when talking to patrons. Then, of course, there was some variant of the language my school friends and I indulged in, as a way to aggravate our teachers and parents by speaking with each other in a manner that was unintelligible to them. Our parents and teachers might have been comfortable with backslang or pig Latin, but we were using the related but different othergov. Duvagoo, yuvagoo, spivageek, othergov. And this is to name just a few of the various dialects. But now, to return to the Cockney dialect, it is perhaps telling that the apparent requirement to name and classify this dialect that's commonly used in the East End appeared around the early 19th century, because at around that same time, concerns and conversations about the so-called, quote, criminal class were also getting underway. A. L. Bayer, when writing about the Australian penal colonies, explains how, quote, Cockney, a dialect of London's working class, flourished in the penal colonies, as contemporaries noted from early in the colony's history. They observed how Cockney convicts used their powers of speech, including oratory, to take a dominant position among prisoners and to resist authority. Bayer continues, quote, in part, the authorities' hostility to Cockney in New South Wales reflected culture wars being fought back in England. For this period saw the rise of accent as social symbol. In distrusting, even decrying the Cockney through their accent and dialect, there is a conflation between the way someone speaks and their perceived economic and or educational disadvantages, and also a potential assumption of their criminality. Indeed, as recently as 2003, Gregory Dart defined the Cockney as, quote, a metropolitan miscreant, a pampered and effeminate child of the city. These representations of the Cockney as being part of a disreputable criminal class were, however, also being coupled with more parodic ones. Take, for example, James Gillray's caricatures of the Cockney. Gillray's Cockney attempts to ape the leisure pursuits of his social betters, with apparently hilarious ineptitude. Then there was Sam Weller's appearance in Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers in 1836. With his distinctively old East End speech patterns and quirks, he was a near-instant hit. Indeed, his introduction into the Pickwick Papers was seen to correlate with the boosting of sales. Derek B. Scott explains that, quote, sales increased 1,000-fold over those for the previous issue. Perhaps it was, at least in part, in recognition of this boost in sales, that between 1837 and 1839, when Dickens was writing Oliver Twist, he used these dialectical and idiomatic differences, similar to those that proved so popular in Pickwick, to be put into the mouth of the criminal characters like the Artful Dodger and Bill Sikes, who would surround, endanger, and attempt to corrupt the eponymous protagonist of this novel. Thus, the Cockney became variously a figure of fear or of fun, but in both cases arguably a caricature and nothing more. From the 20th century up until now, I'd say, Cockneys and life in the East End of London have proved to be a very popular staple on film and TV. Take the BBC soap EastEnders, that's been on the air since 1985. The exploits of East End gangsters Ronnie and Reggie Kray have inspired filmmakers on a few occasions. Indeed, the East End as a hotspot for crime and gang activity does seem to be a recurring theme in this media. I mean, see much of the collected works of Guy Ritchie for more evidence of this, and thus, the focus on East End criminality endures, it would seem. However, this interest, this focus, this fashion, has also apparently engendered a sense of aspiration, I suppose, in some. It is now fashionable to take on the characteristics of the Cockney. All too often, those characteristics come from and present as caricatures. And so in 1967, a new term emerged, mockney, meaning, quote, an accent and form of speech affected especially by a middle-class speaker in imitation of Cockney or of the speech of Londoners, generally mockney accent. However, now this term does not simply apply to the accent, because it's perfectly plausible to call a person a mockney, and when we're doing so, we are calling them a mock Cockney, someone who affects the style of a person who was born in the East End, in the sound of the Bow Bells, and probably who comes from a working class background when the person doing it, the mockney in question, can claim none of those things as being truly their own. The Cockney has therefore seemingly moved from being variously a figure of mockery, pity and or fear to an individual who is deemed worthy of being imitated, at least for some people, and for, I suppose, the period of time while it remains fashionable and useful to them. And maybe I'm guilty of this in part too. I mean, after all, didn't I feel the need to so proudly assert that my youngest son could have the most tentative claim on being a Cockney in real life himself? As for me, I'll have to make do with being an East Ender by choice, a transplant and nothing more, perhaps arguably a mockney myself. Something that I do think is interesting and worth pointing out is that it seems to me that when certain groups, for example, groups of aristocrats or tech moguls, police officers or even military personnel, innovate jargon and speak in cryptolects of the kind that leave outsiders unable to understand what's being said, it tends to be viewed either neutrally or perhaps positively. On the other hand, I've seen it be equally frequently the case that when certain slang and or linguistic innovation is on the receiving end of condemnation and mockery, because it's positioned as being an attack on grammatical correctness, good taste and intellectual standards and so on, it tends not to be those groups that are making these innovations happen. I'm sure that many of us would have seen, maybe even taken part in, criticising algo speak, that dialect that has been designed to subvert the censorship that is present on social media apps. We see the use of words like unalive and corn. They mean other things that I'm going to be showing on screen. Those words draw mockery, and in some cases, fairly unbridled rage. And perhaps these particular innovations do ignite a certain fury in you. However, that doesn't mean that algo speak doesn't serve a purpose, or that it doesn't have value, in much the same way as every other cryptolect did and does. They are windows into a culture, or perhaps a subculture. They are significant. It is, though, I think, telling that the individuals who are originating these more criticised innovations are almost always from groups that are, to varying degrees, marginalised and perhaps vulnerable. The changes we see have been born out of the communication styles of young people, or of those who experience economic struggles, of racial minority groups, and or members of the LGBTQIA+ community, to name just a few. Frequently, members of these groups have, as a result of their identity, found themselves being silenced, surveilled, over-policed, and criminalised. Language shifts. It evolves to meet the needs of its users. They might need it to be a workaround for censorship, a code to evade surveillance, or be a means to shape a cohesive communal identity. Whatever it's being used for, whatever these changes are part of, I find this absolutely fascinating and really very meaningful. But let's hop back to the start of the video and the translation of that paragraph of text that I gave you. I'm going to put it up on screen now. It's time to look at the answers. Someone was going to sneak down the apples, meaning the apples and pears, the stairs, to avoid the trouble and strife, being wife, which will be easy as she's a bit mutton Jeff, meaning deaf. Then get on the dog and bone, phone, to me old China plate mate. So I don't have to go down the rubber dub, or rubber dub, meaning pub. On my Jacks, from Jack Jones, meaning alone. Maybe we'll go for a Ruby Murray, curry. Then I'll head back for a cup of Rosie Lee, tea, before I'm too cream crackered, knackered. So first time around, how much of that did you understand? Did you know what was being said? How close was your translation? Do let me know in the comments. But now, just before we wrap up, I do want to share an anecdote about how, while I was making this video, something from my own childhood suddenly took on an entirely new significance. When I was in primary school, one of my teachers, and I won't say her name here to, frankly, protect the guilty, had this habit of calling us, quote, Burks, if we did something a little bit silly. So we're often warned by her to remember to bring something or do something or other so that we would not be, quote, Burkes. Now, until I sat down to research this video, I thought little of this Burke comment. It was, as far as I was concerned, a gentle, fairly twee teasing word used in response to children who were perhaps going to do something a bit daft. Well, turns out, according to Brewer's Dictionary of London Phrase and Fable, among others, the term Burke is derived from the Cockney rhyming slang, Berkeley Hunt. I have to wonder if anyone at any point ever told my teacher that she had spent much of her career referring to primary school children, and it was an all-girls school, so let's just call it as it was, to primary school girls as, and I'm pretty sure I can't say the real word on here, so I will say as, see you next Tuesdays. I mean, I'm fairly certain that she didn't know or mean to call us that. I'm almost positive. One thing that I am sure of is that I am regretting informing my husband of the true origins of the term Burke, because this information has filled that man with a nearly irrepressible delight. Burke is frankly now his new favourite word. He uses it often and giggles with glee while he does so. I will hasten to add, he is not directing it towards any of us, but I have yet to find anyone or anything else that is exempt. Well, I suppose everyone needs a hobby. So what do you think of the history of Cockneys and their rhyming slang? Do you use any Cockney rhyming phrases in your day-to-day life? And if so, which ones? Do you have a favourite? What about other cryptolects like algo speak? What are your thoughts on them and their value? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video, but I'd also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will boost the engagement, and apparently the more engaged video gets, the more YouTube shares it out, and that should help us to grow our community. As we're talking about accents and speech patterns, is there an emoji for that? Something about talking and speech? I am fascinated to see what you can find out. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to the place you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends. If you like the channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me you like this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to my channel, and if you think you are subscribed, now is the ideal time to check to make sure you have not been mysteriously unsubscribed against your will. While you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear, and that way YouTube claims that they will tell you when I've next uploaded, but also if I'm planning to go live, which I do, and I'll be doing again very soon to talk about the history news, and you are not going to want to miss that. It's been a while, but it's coming back. We have now got our failsafe, of course, as well. Head to my website. It is going to be linked. It is www.katrinamarchant.com. If you go onto the contact page, you'll see a little box. Put your email address in that box and hit submit. That will add you to my list. So I'll be able to send you out a message once a week to let you know what I've been up to, and also to send you some useful links for my content for the coming days. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.